Previously we saw how Herbert Lange, an employee of the Gestapo offices in Stettin, Aachen and in Poznań, killed patients in mental care homes in occupied Poland and Germany. He was the first person to develop a homicidal gas chamber, which he did at Fort 7 in Poznań in October 1939. Then he was the first person to use a homicidal gas van, which was used for the first time at Gniezno in December 1939. Lange was responsible for the first mass killings of the Holocaust in Poland when he destroyed communities in the region of Konin during the summer of 1941 using mobile gas vans. Acting under orders from Berlin, he set up the death camp at Chełmno nad Nerem, which was to take the lives of around 200,000 people, although he was commandant there only for the first few weeks of its operation as from December 1941. In March 1942, Lange was replaced by Hans Bothmann as commandant of the camp, although Lange stayed another 5 weeks to assist him. Bothman was born in 1911 and had previously been with the Gestapo in Poznań, so it's likely that they knew each other quite well. It was normal for SS officers to be moved around. For example, we can see that some were moved between the criminal police, the Kripo, to Einsatzgruppe, to the Gestapo. I presume that Lange's skills were requested by someone in Berlin, and I suspect that that person may have been Arthur Nebe, who himself had led an Einsatzgruppe. Lange was transferred to the Reich Criminal Police under Arthur Nebe at the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin. His job now was investigating those opposed to Nazism. Johanna Solf was born on the 14th of November 1887. Her parents were landowners. In 1908 she married the then Imperial Governor of Samoa, which was then a German colony. He was later the State Secretary in the Foreign Office and the German Ambassador in Tokyo. His name, Wilhelm Solf. Hanna Solf saw herself not only as his wife, but also as a comrade in arms in the fight for humanity, law and peace. The couple shared very progressive views reinforced by long stays abroad. The couple founded a group they called the Solf Circle to discuss matters related to cultural exchanges and progressive politics. Clearly neither regarded Hitler with any pleasure. After the Nazi seizure of power, she made contact with critics of the regime such as General von Hammerstein. The meetings were held in the Solf's apartment on Alsenstrasse in Berlin. Wilhelm Solf died in 1936. In 1941, the Japanese Foreign Minister, Matsuko Yosuke, paid a visit to the Solf Circle. Roland Freisler, then at the Justice Ministry, had placed Johanna Solf under observation. The group was assisting people to escape to Switzerland using false passports. Sometimes refugees swam across Lake Constance. Solf purchased a house in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in which her sister Elisabeth Dotti could live. When Solf and her daughter were completely bombed out in 1943, they found refuge there. It was Lange who was entrusted with infiltrating the group. On the 10th of September 1943, he managed to place an informant, Paul Rexer, in a group organized by Elisabeth von Tadden. Paul Rexer was born on the 4th of November 1913 in Berlin. His father was also called Paul, and he was a professor of medicine. The younger Rexer studied medicine from 1933 to 1939. At the beginning of his studies, he joined the National Socialist Party. After receiving his doctorate in 1940, he worked as an assistant doctor at the Birkenwerder Hospital at the Reich Medical Association and in the Reich Ministry for the occupied Eastern Territories. Herbert Lange recruited him to be a Gestapo spy in the summer of 1943. Lange got Rexer to travel to Switzerland in August 1943 to research contacts between the German emigrants there and the Allies. September the 21st, 1943 was the 50th birthday of a member of the group, Anza Brauner. Guests at the event to celebrate this birthday included Hanna Solf, Arthur Zarden and his daughter Irmgard, Hilge van Scheppenberg, Otto Kiep, Richard Künzer and Fanny von Kurowski, whose father had been a cabinet member of Bismarck's in the 1870s. Paul Rexer had called Elisabeth von Tadden the day before. She had a very good friend in Switzerland, the daughter of the painter Segatini. This daughter knew Rexer's father. The Rexers always went on vacation in Sils Maria in Switzerland, so the families had known each other for a very long time. Paul Rexer told Elisabeth von Tadden that Miss Segatini requested her to introduce him to people who had similar views in Berlin. It would appear that Segatini had no knowledge that Rexer was Lange's plant. However, the whole situation should have presented alarm bells. Lange may have arranged for Rexer to travel to Switzerland, but they should have known from their own experience how difficult it was for anyone to travel there, never mind a 29-year-old doctor who should perhaps have been at the front. Nonetheless, Elisabeth von Tadden invited Rexer to the birthday party. Arthur Zarden had been state secretary in the Reich Ministry of Finance during the Weimar Republic and was a member of the Solf Circle. In 1995, in New York, his daughter Irmgard, who was at the birthday party for around half an hour, described Rexer thus: "A young man, not even 30 years old, with a rather flabby face. Pretty average appearance. He was heavily involved in the conversations, even though people were otherwise so incredibly careful with people they didn't know. Nobody that afternoon seemed to wonder who he actually was. The conversation immediately turned to the fall of Italy, the overthrow and arrest of Mussolini, and what it might mean for the course of the war. In 1943, even the smallest doubts about Germany's ultimate victory was considered high treason. However, perhaps in the euphoria of the overthrow of Mussolini, some people were not as cautious as they might otherwise have been only a few weeks earlier." Rexer took part in the conversation and then said, "I'll soon be heading back to Switzerland, and if you have any letters for your friends there, I'd be happy to take them and mail them from Switzerland." Irmgard said that when they were returning home, her father said, "I wish I hadn't come. I thought that man was very odd. He had immediately noticed that something wasn't quite right, but it would have also been strange if he'd left immediately. For a time, nothing happened, but we all noticed that our telephone calls were being monitored because it was a rather primitive technology in those days, and one could hear it clicking." Helmut von Moltke, who worked in military intelligence, warned the others that Rexer was a Gestapo informant. In mid-October, Rexer called the Zardens and said that he'd be soon going to Switzerland again and asked if he could drop by. He would be happy, he said, to take letters with him again and mail them in Switzerland. Irmgard told her father that it would have been wrong to have turned down the visit. So he answered, "Come on by on Sunday morning." Arthur Zarden said he had a friend in Lugano to whom he sometimes wrote, but he didn't have a problem if the censors read it. But Rexer continued pushing with the knowledge we have now. Clearly, he wanted evidence against Zarden. On the 12th of January 1944, there was another tea party. This time the Gestapo arrived and arrested everyone present. Helmut von Moltke was also arrested. Elisabeth von Tadden was by this time working for the Red Cross in France, and she was arrested there. Arthur Zarden committed suicide on the 18th of January 1944 by jumping out of the window at Joachim Friedrichstrasse No. 2, a Gestapo building near Kurfürstendamm in Berlin, where Lange and others interrogated the group. By this time, Herbert Lange was known for torturing male prisoners, although it seems he did not subject women to torture. The interrogations were nothing but a fishing expedition. The Gestapo had nothing on them because there was nothing to be had. This was a peaceful group. They were not trying to violently overthrow the National Socialist state. Lange accused Irmgard Zarden of being involved in high treason. She responded, "High treason? What's that supposed to mean?" That was no high treason, it was just a few retired people talking about the events of the day. Lange told Irmgard Zarden of the death of her father. She said, "He was very, very, very uncomfortable. In response, I threw a tantrum and said, 'I'm going to survive all this, but you won't.' I always found it surprising that this never had any negative consequences for me, but Lange simply ignored it." Lange had the Zarden home searched. They discovered a postcard from 1931 from Josef Wirt, who had been Reich Chancellor during the Weimar Republic. Wirt lived in Sils Maria, which had become a kind of centre for critics of the National Socialist regime during the war. But Arthur Zarden had had no contact with him for years. The card made Lange unbelievably agitated. Irmgard said, "Listen, the man was on vacation. He sent us a postcard. There's nothing to it." Irmgard Zarden was put in pre-trial detention in Ravensbrück. She was brought before Lange one last time. Lange told her, "Keep your head up." She answered, "It's easy enough for you to say that. I've been charged with preparation of high treason and with a failure to report a crime." Irmgard Zarden was brought before the People's Court. Roland Freisler was presiding. He asked Irmgard, "Why didn't you report the things your father said?" She responded, "I didn't need to, because I knew that Dr. Rexer, who is sitting behind me right now, had already reported it to the Gestapo." And Freisler said, "It's difficult to counter that argument." She was released due to a lack of evidence, but others were not so lucky. Rexer was the main prosecution witness and received court praise for exposing the activities of the enemies of the state inside and of emigrants outside. This is what is left today of the Mühlberg special camp where the Soviet occupation forces held its suspects, one of whom was Paul Rexer. During the National Socialist era, this had been a prisoner of war camp. Rexer later ended up here and also in another former National Socialist camp, this time Buchenwald. The Soviet Judicial Administration also investigated Lange for his activities at the Gestapo. Rexer was eventually brought to trial and on the 3rd of June 1950 he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The judgment noted he continued to report derogatory statements made by non-fascists, particularly the listening in of enemy stations. The defendant repeatedly had to appear as a witness in political trials. Based on his information, high penalties were often imposed. Rexer said in court in his defence, "In order to carry out my task, it was necessary that I behaved in an anti-Nazi manner, which in principle corresponded to my inner attitude. I was constantly under the psychological pressure of being threatened by Detective Lange and was far too afraid of him to report anything wrong or colour the reports. I always had to assume that I was being watched. On the other hand, the need for recognition that I've already mentioned may also have played a role in my voluntary reports, in that I, probably acting subconsciously, wanted to show Lange what kind of a man I really was." I'll deal with the story of Paul Rexer in another video. He worked not only for the National Socialist Germany, but also for what was in effect its successor state, East Germany. This photograph shows Johanna Solf giving evidence at Nuremberg after the war. However, she too had to endure National Socialist captivity. Johanna Solf was arrested on the 12th of January 1944 at Garmisch-Partenkirchen. After a stay in the Gestapo prison in Munich, they were taken to Berlin and then to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Although she was tortured and interrogated almost every day, she did not betray any of the Solf Circle members. Presumably it was Lange who interrogated her. Whereas he failed to get any information out of Johanna Solf, he did break the group up. Over 70 members of the group were arrested. Other resistance fighters such as Karl Langbein and Marie-Louise Saar were investigated, arrested and interrogated by Lange. Langbein had been to Switzerland where he'd made contact with Alan Dulles of the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. He was arrested on his return to Germany.
Das ist der Platz des verbrecherischen Anschlages, den ein kleiner Kreis gewissenloser Offiziere am 20. Juli auf den Führer und auf den Stab der Wehrmachtführung verübte. Ein gerechtes Schicksal hat das Verbrechen missglücken lassen.
On the 20th of July 1944 there was an attempted coup against Hitler. The bomb planted by von Stauffenberg failed to kill the dictator, and by the end of that day the revolt had been quashed. This was the largest resistance organisation in Germany, and hundreds of people had been involved to a lesser or greater extent. It was his role to lead the Lange Commission, investigate, arrest and interrogate suspects before handing them over to Roland Freisler and the People's Court. Those he interrogated personally include company director Walter Kremer, trade unionist Nicholas Gross and journalist Rudolf Pechel. Another person he interrogated was the wife of Peter Bielenberg, Christabel Bielenberg, who was British. I've done a separate video on her, and as always you can find the link below. On the 4th of January 1945, Christabel Bielenberg was summoned to the Gestapo building at Prinz Albrechtstrasse 8 in Berlin to be interrogated by Herbert Lange. Whilst waiting, her terror turned to anger when she saw one of the typists in the office hitting a prisoner. As for Lange, in 1968 she described him thus: "Now I could recognise him. No longer just a disembodied false voice, but a short, stocky, even younger man with a pear-shaped head. He had dark, thinning hair over a high, narrow forehead, plump cheeks and a small mouth with thick lips. He was certainly no beauty, but it was the look of his eyes that made him so terrifying. They were lying close together, very small, very blue, very cold, and staring at me intently and alertly." Christabel Bielenberg bluffed that she had friends in high places in the British establishment. I suspect that Lange by this time was looking for a way out. Of course having her killed would not have bothered him in the slightest, but he let her go. Her husband, who was imprisoned in Ravensbrück concentration camp, was also released, presumably on Lange's instructions. In theory, Peter Bielenberg was to go to a Wehrmacht punishment unit, but he had managed to avoid reporting for duty. He went to his wife and then went into hiding. My theory is that Lange wanted someone to put in a good word for him after the inevitable defeat. Therefore, he allowed Bielenberg to get out of Ravensbrück and turned a blind eye to his escape. I need to emphasise that this is just a supposition. Peter Bielenberg was not the only one in Ravensbrück. Lange had sent his family there, although of course they were living in the staff accommodation, which you can see in this footage. He sent them there for safety. By February 1945, the Red Army crossed the River Oder and was only around 80 kilometers from Berlin. Attempts to stop the Soviet advance were futile. Now every man was needed at the front, and seeking out the German resistance was a lower priority. Lange was one of those who was drafted into the military, presumably the Waffen-SS. On the 17th of April 1945, the Red Army broke through the German lines on the Seelower Heights to the east of Berlin. SS Sturmbannführer Herbert Lange was reported killed in the vicinity of Bernau by Berlin on the 20th of April 1945, although his body was never found. Irmgard Zarden said in the 1995 interview that she had heard that Lange was seen after the fall of Berlin in a car near the Soviet intelligence office. I think that this may be a case of mistaken identity, but it's always possible that he went to work for the communists. There is another possibility. He may have been picked up by the Americans. How? I don't know. However, his personnel file was missing, and this suggests that US intelligence may have picked it up. Herbert Lange was much less known than others who had allegedly disappeared, such as Gestapo director Heinrich Müller or Martin Bormann, who undoubtedly died in Berlin, or even Josef Mengele, who genuinely did escape. So therefore it's possible that he might have survived. The starting point would be his family. However, I'm unable to say if anyone ever bothered to look for them. The family had been living in the Steglitz area of Berlin, but Lange had moved them out to SS accommodation at Ravensbrück. The Red Army reached Ravensbrück on the 1st of May 1945, so the family may have escaped west. Lange was clearly a very good organizer. He arrived in Poznań only days after the capture of the city. Up until then, he'd been an official of the Aachen Gestapo. He immediately started the organization of the terror and killing. Before much thought had been given to murdering the sick in the care homes, he organized the killing in the Warthegau. He was so good at it that he was owned out to other places. His skills were such that once the killing at the Kulmhof death camp started, he was considered too valuable to be left there, so he was brought back to the Reich. He was needed heading the fight against the resistance, which was to become a real threat to the regime, as opposed to the imaginary threat of a Jewish conspiracy. As an educated person, he would have known the difference between a real threat and that of the imagined threat that Jews were to the conspiracy theorists. Lange did not care who he killed, whether they be Polish, German or Soviet, Christian, atheist or Jewish. He got on with it. And it would seem that he tried to do this as efficiently as possible, although one would question why gas fans were used at Chełmno instead of a permanent gas chamber, which would have been much more efficient. He had knowledge of the resistance inside Germany, both communist and liberal, and it may have been that which would have been of use either to the Soviet Union or to the United States of America. Thus, this story ends with no ending. Sometimes a video like this produces answers from viewers who have knowledge. If anyone has anything to say, please put it in the comments section below. I upload every Friday and now every Tuesday at 2000 hours Central European time, and sometimes I upload on other dates as well. Recently I've started uploading short videos from places I have visited. The Holocaust is my specialist area in history, so if you're interested in this, then you might want to subscribe. For the moment, thanks for listening.